Has net zero and environmental policy contributed to this energy crisis?
It's clear to us all that to keep 1.5 degrees in reach, we need to consign coal to history and make clean energy our future.
That's official government policy as laid out by Kwasi Kwarteng at the recent COP26 summit. And in one sense, it's been remarkably effective. Have a look at this. This is where we get our power from in the UK these days. 27.5 gigawatts on average in 2021. And if I just show you, look, these are the component parts of where that power, that electricity comes from. And I'll move them across so we can compare the size of them. Have a look. Look, gas, the biggest chunk, then wind, then nuclear, then biomass, and so on. It's worth noting a few things. Just have a look on the right-hand side at how low coal, that black bar is. Coal. That used to be our biggest source of power, but not anymore. And that's a big part of the story of falling emissions, not just in the UK, but in many other countries as well. The longer these bars are, the bigger the emissions. We're just comparing general emissions for different types of fuel sources, power sources, and have a look. Gas, the red bit there, that has 44% lower emissions than coal. Now, of course, there's a big gap between gas and the rest. Have a look at the other sources, in particular, looking at wind, nuclear and hydro. But don't discount the importance of those disparities between fossil fuels. If China shifted all of its coal-fired power stations to gas, we'd instantly be on track to keep global warming below 2 degrees C. It's a big difference. And in a sense, it's more or less what's happening already. Have a look at Chinese imports of key fuels. Here is coal. So that's coal imports into China over the last few years, goes back to 2007. And here's liquefied natural gas, so a form of gas that you can import. And just have a look at that red line. It's overtaken coal imports. That's a massive shift. And that switch in the global energy mix could be pushing the price higher everywhere. And that's what the Bank of England governor said the other day, warning that this dynamic could cause more price shocks.
I think it's very important as we go forwards with what is obviously a very long transition, necessarily so, to net zero, that we understand the implications of the adjustment path here. And we understand the implications for the demand for conventional energy sources and how those are switching, because otherwise, we could get more shocks.
Now, it's hard to say how much of an impact that's had. It's probably much smaller than things like COVID or Russia, for instance, but it's a possible part of the explanation for why prices are going up internationally. And that matters especially to countries like the UK, which have quite a lot of wind power. Why? Take a look at this. This is our power mix just the other weekend. You see, same kind of charts we had before, but for a single day. And have a look at that blue bar there. Look at that. That's wind. Wind accounting for more than half of our electricity on that day. But now look, a few days earlier than that, when the wind wasn't blowing. And have a look at how those bars have changed. Look, wind down a lot, about 10%, and gas providing the majority of our power. You see the issue? Even though we're building out enormous renewable capacity, we still need some sort of backup for when the wind's not blowing. In the longer run, we'll hopefully have batteries, hydrogen, or other sustainable storage, but we're not there yet.
We have to develop cost-effective, viable means of turning electricity into, say, hydrogen, storing that hydrogen in large quantities, and then being able to turn that back into electricity when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
And for the time being, as well as wind, there's gas. Some days we don't need much, but since the international price is so high because everyone wants more of it, well, that means we end up paying higher prices. So yes, environmental policy might play a part in higher global gas prices, but it's only one of lots of factors. But there's also something you've probably noticed because it's there in your monthly energy bill. This is the breakdown of a typical bill as of the latest Ofgem numbers, that price cap coming in. And have a look. I'm going to break it down and you can see the constituent parts. Wholesale costs, by far the biggest part. In other words, that's your international gas prices. Policy costs over here. There you go. Now, that includes some environmental contributions, but they're not enormous, but they're not trivial either, about 8% of bills. And they do make our bills higher, but here's the thing. That is largely a consequence of the past. Here's why. Renewables used to be much more expensive than other forms of power. This is one way of looking at it. This is called levelised cost, and it's looking at the energy costs over the entire lifetime of the plant for things like gas, coal, wind and solar. This was back in 2009, but just look at what's happened since then. This is 2021. Isn't that extraordinary? I'm going to show you just one more time. So back in 2009, here's how much more expensive wind and solar were, and just look at what's happened since then. They've come down enormously. Now, cheaper than gas or coal-powered stations. It's pretty extraordinary, isn't it? But we're still paying off the bill for those expensive years when those bars were really high. But it's worth noting something else, something important. These bars are the average cost over 30 years. So with fossil fuels, that's mostly, well, that's fuel. It's gas and coal for the boilers. With renewables, the wind and the solar power are free, but most of the cost comes up front. So let's look, rather than looking at that spread over a period of decades, let's look just at those upfront costs. So same kind of thing, this is just the capex costs. And just look at how much more expensive wind and solar are. Now, both of what I've just shown you there are valid ways of looking at it, but here's why this version matters here. If we were really serious about net zero, you'd probably expect evidence in the numbers on total spending. We should be spending quite a lot right now on wind and solar and less in the future. But is that happening? Well, if we have a look at global spending on primary power, so this is across the world, you can see it rose and rose up until 2015, and had it carried on at that rate, here's where it would have gone, that dotted line, that's the trend. But instead, look what's actually happened. It's essentially stagnated. So for all the talk about getting to net zero, it's not obvious governments and companies have been spending quite enough.
The government has quite high ambitions for offshore wind, 40 gigawatts by 2030, but actually we're not yet on track to get there. So we do need to be seeing greater investment in renewables over, particularly over the next 5 to 10 years.
Let me show you another chart that shows you just how much this matters. This one's from the International Energy Agency, and it shows you just how we're going to eliminate potentially carbon emissions. If we want to get to net zero by 2050, that's how you kind of get rid of it. So 7% comes through behavioural change, that dark blue bit. 46%, that's essentially the technology we already have. So things like wind turbines, deploying solar panels, it gets you further of the way. The further we go there, the more of those emissions you've reduced. But 47%, look there, that red bit, the biggest chunk of this is reliant on technology that we're still inventing and developing today. That chunk is how we get to net zero. That's how we get there. But again, if we are going to get there, we need to spend a lot more on research and development to work out how to come up with that stuff. And how are we doing on that? Well, this chart has the answer. I'm afraid it's a little depressing. This is how much government's been spending investing specifically in energy R&D, so working out that tech. And as you can see, far from being at record highs, it was back at highs in the post-1970s oil crisis peak. It's actually considerably lower now than it was back then. 0.04% of GDP being spent by governments on trying to work out the tech that's going to get us there. You see, put it all together, it's not quite the story you might have expected. Is net zero responsible for the current energy crisis? Well, maybe a bit. It's pushing up global demand for gas, lifting our bills a bit. But the real problem is that while our politicians have begun to outlaw fossil fuels, it's not obvious they're spending the necessary amount on green technologies, which means a potential shortage of supply long term. In other words, the real energy crisis might not be this one, but the one that's coming up in the next few years.